Welcome to the France 24 debate. I'm Mark Owen. Paris is bracing for trouble, perhaps. The soccer match could become the latest flashpoint over the Gaza war, with Jewish and Muslim demonstrators. They could be face to face. France playing Israel on Thursday evening. Already Israel's squad is here and in training, but staying at a location which is being kept deliberately secret to avoid any problems. This game takes place in the wake of violence in Amsterdam last week. Israeli supporters were beaten up in what the Dutch Prime Minister condemned as anti-Semitic attacks. It was also the question of Israeli fans tearing down a Palestinian flag and burning it, and racist anti-Arab chants. Well, Emmanuel Macron, the French president, has signalled that he will be at the France-Israel game in the stands, flanked by Prime Minister Michel Barnier, Nicolas Sarkozy and François Hollande. Two former presidents will be there too. A show of solidarity in many ways with France in the game of football. Ordinary fans, though, who don't have such protection as the VIPs, well, they are increasingly saying that they're concerned this game will become a flashpoint for anti-Israeli, pro-Palestinian demonstrators and inevitably perhaps violence. They are staying away in droves. It is one of the smallest crowds and expected at the Stade de France on Thursday night for this game. In this debate, we'll be examining the cause and effect. Is this, as the Amsterdam mayor Femke Halsema suggests, about entrenched anti-Semitism, or is it directly linked to Israel's bombardment of the Gaza Strip? That's especially relevant to what happened in Amsterdam. The panel to discuss the issues, and let me introduce them to you in no order of preference. Everyone's welcome and everyone gets their say. Joining us by Skype from Lisbon is Katarina Pietlovic, Assistant Professor of Sports Law at Catholic Global School of Law, head of the Palestinian Football Association of its legal department. Katarina, thank you for being with us. We'll be coming to you very shortly. Here in the studio, Gershon Baskin is a former Israeli hostage negotiator, columnist for the Times of Israel and for Al-Quds. Gershon, thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Joining us by Skype from Coventry in central England, we have Simon Chadwick. Simon is Professor of Sport and Geopolitical Economy. Thank you, Simon, for being with us. Last but not least, here in the set, here in the studio, Jean-Émile Jamin, France 24 sports journalist, also a commentator on Africa football, and someone who's called upon for his expertise on many sports, always willing to give us his insight on matters, and that will be much appreciated. Before we let our panel loose, let's set the scene. This report from Siobhan Silk.
4,000 extra police officers, a double security perimeter around the stadium, some of the precautions being taken ahead of Thursday's UEFA Nations League match between France and Israel. Authorities are on alert after the scenes in Amsterdam last week, when fans of Israeli side Maccabi Tel Aviv were attacked while they were in the city for a match against Dutch team Ajax. The Israeli fans were also accused of vandalism and chanting racist slogans. The violence spilled over into this week. Dozens of people rioted in Amsterdam on Monday, and the police chief warned there could be more unrest ahead. Many people living near the Stade de France say they're not concerned that similar incidents could happen there.
I went to the Olympics. It went very, very well. And there were delegations from Israel and from all over the world.
Still, some local businesses have decided to close on match day.
I'm scared too. Maybe I'll close early, 2-3 p.m. It's natural after seeing what happened in Amsterdam.
The Israeli government has advised fans not to attend the match. The warning comes as the French Interior Ministry reported anti-Semitic incidents in France quadrupled in a single year, but it's rejected suggestions the match could be cancelled or postponed.
No battle can be lost in the face of anti-Semitism. If our country backs down, abandons the organisation of this match, it means that we cannot guarantee respect for the most basic rules in our country.
Pro-Palestinian activists believe while the war in Gaza is raging, Israel should not be allowed to participate in any international sports event. They call the match a shameful encounter and are urging members of the France squad to boycott.
Siobhan Silk, expertly setting all aspects of this debate there into that short report. Thank you, Siobhan, for that. I'm struck by something that was said by one of the interviewees in that report about why doesn't it happen at the Olympics. Let me bring in Simon Chadwick to maybe give us a thought on that one. Simon, why is it always football that is the conduit for any kind of violence, not just political violence, it could be any number of kind of protest elements. Why does it always happen in football?
It's the global game. It's the people's game. Lots of people know football, understand football. There are very few barriers to our engagement with it, our consumption of it. And what we've seen over not just a period of years or even decades, but really over the past century, is that football is a very powerful means through which people engage in collective action. Sometimes that collective action is peaceful, other times it's not. But certainly we've seen conflicts even in recent years, over the last 30 years, and I'm thinking particularly here of the war in the Balkans during the early 90s, where football was very rapidly weaponized and became a focus for negative collective action rather than positive action.
So it's not a question of, in this debate, of understanding what football's about. It's understanding what role it plays culturally, what role it plays sociologically.
I mean, I guess in simple terms, football is easy to understand. You don't need any special equipment. Most people are familiar with the rules. You've got 2 goals. You try to score goals. So in that sense, it's a very simple medium through which to engage. But I think at the heart of all sports, not just football, but sport in general, the kind of basic DNA of human beings, which is about survival and security, comes to the fore. And this is one of the reasons, I think, why we've seen over many, many years violence in football, because this territorialism, this contesting that humans engage in when they're trying to protect themselves and stay secure, spills over into football, and football really enables and embodies that. So, I think we can look for deep sociological explanations, and certainly there are those kinds of explanations, as well as some sociocultural and I think also geopolitical explanations too. But at its very heart, football is about the survival instinct and about competing with rivals who pose a threat to us. And I think in this kind of 2024, this first quarter century of the 21st century, we do live in very complex and sensitive times, and football is reflecting that.
Simon, for now, thank you very much indeed. Let's come to the studio with Gershon Baskin, former Israeli hostage negotiator, columnist for the Times of Israel and Al-Quds. You told us you don't understand football. You don't need to understand football for this debate, because what it's about is why this has happened. In many ways, what we saw in Amsterdam was kind of reflecting society back at us.
I think there are 2 important points to make about what happened in Amsterdam and what hopefully won't happen here in Paris. One is that violence is never acceptable. And the random violence that we saw on the streets of Amsterdam has to be condemned by everyone. There's no excuse for it. There's no legitimation for it. The other thing that's really important to note is that anti-Semitism is illegitimate at all times, always. Criticism of Israel, on the other hand, is completely legitimate.
There is a separation there. Yes.
There is a separation here, and the distinction has to be made. There could be anti-Semitism amongst those who criticize Israel, and that would be illegitimate. Yeah. But criticizing Israel, boycotting Israel, protesting against an Israeli national team playing is legitimate, not the use of violence, but the protest and the criticism of Israel is.
What were your thoughts when you saw what happened in Amsterdam? We'll move on to, obviously, other things, but just to sort of get your thoughts on what happened in Amsterdam a week ago.
Well, we in Israel, I was watching it from Israel, and we in Israel only got one side of the picture. We got all the stories of the anti-Semitism, the violence, the Israeli citizens who were hurt and wounded and were escorted out of the country swiftly by Israeli rescue planes. We didn't see any of what was reported later in the international media of how some of the Israeli fans had shouted anti-Arab racist slogans, how they removed a Palestinian flag. We didn't see any of that in Israel. We got a very one-sided picture of it. But again, it's horrifying to see the violence around a sports match. The sport was initiated, the Olympics, the whole idea of bringing rivals together to compete peacefully on a field shouldn't spill over into violence in the streets afterwards.
Indeed, never happens at the Olympics, never happens at a big rugby match, but football is always, as Simon pointed out, has this way of tapping into something very tribal and very primitive in the instinct of survival and defending of territory that people go down to. And of course, there's an extension of that, I think. Katerina Pietrovich, assistant professor of sports law at the Catholic Global School, but, and most important for this one, head of the Palestinian Football Association's legal department. Thanks for joining us here on the France 24 debate. I'd be interested to get your feelings first off about what happened in Amsterdam. I mean, clearly there was a face-off between not just the Israeli fans and perhaps some Arab local people, but also fans of the local football club.
Yes, well, this is very recognized that football is more prone to violence than any other sport. It is something that Court of Arbitration of Sport has also recognized. And what happened in Amsterdam was very much expected. When Mossad has accompanied this group of football, I would not even call them hooligans. These are ultras, because they have, they sing racist songs, they glorify the murder of children, and they have brought this with them to Amsterdam. When they arrived, it was, of course, not to make a small out of the concerns that there was some anti-Semitism also, but this would also happen in a normal football match. Where one club comes with the supporters that are very hostile, that are ravaging the city, that are singing racist songs. And there is a lot of that was happening as well, that it was actually inflated and instigated by the group of supporters. Whether you want to see this as something that was sponsored by Israeli government or not, that is another question. Whether the reaction by the people in Amsterdam was justified or not, that is also another question. And violence is obviously never an answer. But what we know for sure is that it was expected. This group of supporters could not have not expected that this will take place. So this is basically also one aspect. Another one is that many of them are in IDF as either active or soldiers that were in Gaza, and they are just on break from committing war crimes in Gaza. And I think this has triggered a lot of people in Amsterdam that has a large Arab minority. So I would say what happened was very much expected with this particular group, because they also have in their background in Greece, they have beat Arab man unconscious, and he has been in hospital and so on. So we could have expected and we could have seen everything coming. What was portrayed later on as anti-Semitism was probably just one part of the story. The other part that was extremely important and providing extremely important context was completely ignored by media and politicians. And I'm glad that there is a program that will discuss this properly and take into account the entire context in which it took place, because context is really everything.
Context is everything, Katerina, and thank you for giving us your initial comments. We'll get back to you very, very shortly. Jean-Emile, can I bring you in on this one? Because obviously, from a sports journalist perspective, one sees Ajax playing. Ajax, of course, the most successful Dutch football team of all time. What are they? I think big four in terms of success and winning things across Europe. And of course, the club that gave us Johan Cruyff and created total football, and sort of it's a beauty to behold how they play football when they play it well. Ajax is a club with Jewish roots. It grew out of the Jewish sector of Amsterdam. One wouldn't expect Israeli fans, and you made the separation, Gershon, between Israeli or between Zionist and being Jewish. You said they can be different things. They can be the same, but they can be different. One wouldn't have expected this to happen.
Well,
naively I'm saying this. One wouldn't have expected this to happen with Maccabi Tel Aviv going to Ajax.
You wouldn't expect it if it was against Ajax fans. Now, there's nothing to indicate that actual Ajax football supporters were even involved in this. To be honest, most of those that they said were involved in those hit and runs on the Maccabi Tel Aviv supporters were just hooded youths. That was what has been reported throughout media, whether it's pro-Israeli or pro-Palestinian. But you're absolutely correct, because you have to even go through the Jewish quarter to get to the Johan Cruyff Arena in Amsterdam. It is traditionally a club which shows a lot of solidarity with the Jewish community. And they even have an alliance almost, if you could say, with Maccabi themselves. So certainly I would absolve Ajax of any blame in this. but it's very much looking at the problem of what happened in Amsterdam and the average person on the street. Now, if you're looking at the different communities within Ajax, within Amsterdam itself, you've got a very small Jewish minority, I would say about 40,000 people, a much larger Arab community, which have obviously been affected by the events in Gaza, showing their support or retaliating like we saw now. And so it really is, it's football related, but this is very unique in terms of the fact that while there were hooligans involved, those who retaliated against them were not necessarily football people.
And it didn't happen in the football stadium. It happened before the game and after the game outside the stadium.
In my experience of football hooliganism in the widest term of it, sort of going back to when I was a child, my misspent youth and reporting on these kind of things, it can happen almost anywhere. So yeah, it's one of the things. But please continue what you're saying.
No, I think that it's a very relevant point that it's not necessarily sports related. It's related to the context, and the context is the horrible war that's going on in Gaza, the war crimes that were committed by Hamas on October 7th, and the war crimes that have been committed by Israel since then. And the world is very upset. Jews are upset about what's going on. Israelis are upset about what's going on, are traumatized. And so are Palestinians and other Arabs. And we're living in a world of deep trauma while this killing goes on. It's now happening in Lebanon as well. There's a lot of anger. And we need to channel the anger into political action, not into violence.
Katerina, can I come back to you, please? Katerina Pletovic, head of the Palestine Football Association's legal department. In terms of what this means to the Palestinian football people, can you give us a sense of that?
Well, first of all, in terms of the Palestinian football people, there aren't really many of them left, because we know that 341, according to the latest statistics, of footballers have been killed, including probably over 100 children now in the football academies. We know that the stadia has been devastated, and as the previous guest said, there is a deep trauma that that has now been running for over 400 days, and that has been running deep into the history as well. Basically, of course, that there will be reactions in terms of seeing who these hooligans were, and seeing how they were accompanied by Mossad, and seeing that media, and in particular politicians, have presented this as only one-sided story, which kind of tells you all you need to know about the wider context and the wider picture. There are clearly here two sides of the story. Only one was pushed, only one was presented, exaggerated, and the hooded youth that you saw running with the sticks and beating people at random, those were actually Israeli fans from Maccabi Tel Aviv. We are obviously experiencing something that we haven't seen yet, and in terms of having a country posing such a huge security and safety risks, being integrated into European football structure, into the world football structure, and nobody is really from these world governing bodies or European governing bodies is trying to do anything about this. So it is just, for Palestinians, this is just a business as usual in terms of how they are portrayed as something that really is not at all important, just a footnote, whereas the plight of Israelis is made into everything, and it is made into the main story, and anti-Semitism was at the forefront of every single politician's statement that came in concert from everybody. We saw from Biden, we saw from Trudeau, from von der Leyen, and from Macron. We saw practically identical statements at almost the same time. So they were acting in concert to present this as one-sided story. And this is something Palestinians are used to. And I don't think there has been any major reaction. It is just one story out of millions that happen every day in their personal lives. And in the Palestinian FA, something that people don't know, they have a lot of issues of safety and security of their own. I guess because every week, at least once, there is a gas bomb thrown at their HQ in Ramallah and so on. So it is not really, this is not an unusual story for Palestinians, and the way that it was presented and the way that it was politically defended, just one-sided story. That's something that is quite commonplace.
Katerina, thank you. And Gershon, you touched on that fact that you heard one side in Israel, then of course you come out of Israel, you hear a different side, so you acknowledge that in fairness. If you'll permit me, I'll go to Simon Chadwick and come back to you in a moment. Simon Chadwick, Professor of Sport and Geopolitical Economy in Coventry, home of Coventry City, of course, among others. Simon, in terms of what Katerina was just saying then about the fact, say, the football authorities don't really have any great sense of what's going on in terms of the on-the-ground experience of normal fans. I think that's the case. And then you can multiply it by any number when you consider what people are going through now today in the Middle East.
Yeah, it's been an interesting conversation to listen to, because there are precedents from the past which perhaps provide a pointer as to where we might go in the future. If we recall the second half of the 1980s and the early 1990s, English clubs were actually banned from Europe for episodes of hooligan violence, and this had gone on for quite some time. So, we've seen from UEFA previously where they do have the power, they do have the authority to ban clubs and to ban clubs from several clubs from the same country for a period of time. Of course, what we're seeing is at the moment just a small number of episodes in European football. But if this is a pattern of behaviour that continues to grow and is sustained over a period of time, one wonders where that might actually lead UEFA and what kind of decisions UEFA might make. But I think what's really interesting, not just about UEFA, but I think we're seeing this across sports governing bodies generally, is we might say an inconsistency in the ways that these governing bodies are responding to these complex and sensitive episodes. If we take UEFA as one example, it responded far more quickly to Russia's invasion of Ukraine than it has in terms of Israel and its relations with other European countries, particularly those that the national team plays. So that's one observation I would make. The second observation I would make, and I go back to the early stages of the conflict in the immediate aftermath of the 7th and 8th of October, is we had a lot of organizations across world sport actually drafting their statements in response to the conflict using ChatGPT. Now, me personally, I find that absolutely astounding that in a complicated world, we would be reverting to quite immature artificial intelligence tools to tell us how to respond. And the issue that I'm trying to highlight, and the most important point I'm trying to make, is a lot of sports governing bodies and event organizers are sports people. They're not geopoliticians. They're not political scientists. They're not necessarily knowledgeable about or trained to be leaders and managers in highly sensitive, complicated environments. And so I would argue that at this moment in our history, certainly in the history of sport, the people who are leading these organizations simply don't have the expertise. They don't have the competence. I'm not going to say they don't have the intellect. I'm sure they do, but certainly they lack the insight. They lack the knowledge to be making the kind of considered and very sensitive decisions that the episode.
Simon, you mentioned the ban on English clubs in Europe. That was 85 at Heysel. 38 Italian fans killed when Liverpool fans rioted in the final against Juventus. We can then quote 1989, the Hillsborough disaster. 96 Liverpool fans killed in a crush at an FA Cup semi-final against Nottingham Forest. I recall covering that as a journalist at the time, that the reaction from the authorities was as you've just said it. It was as though all they could talk about was football rather than the fact that there were people who were dead. It was an absolute disaster. Are you saying that it hasn't changed since then? The mentality hasn't changed?
Well, obviously, I think the risk and security around events and the way in which governing bodies consider or assess risk and security, it has changed. But I think if you go back to the Champions League final in in the middle of 2022, when the Champions League final was moved from St. Petersburg to Paris. We saw even then in 2022 lots of people being stuck outside the Stade de France, and tear gas was shot out, and there was a crushing of fans. So when you've got large groups of people coming together, even if they move fairly freely and through the streets, nevertheless they're in close proximity to one another. And once you do get even just one small episode, that kind of domino effect through crowds can prove to be very dangerous. But just to say in response to what you observed about English football, there was a catalogue of episodes over a period of years. It wasn't just in 1985 and 1989. It was over a longer period of time. But certainly the governing body saw fit to take action. And as I say, what happens next, I think UEFA has to look at this very, very carefully, because if we are going to see repeated episodes of violence, and it doesn't really matter where those episodes of violence or who the perpetrators of that violence is, if it's going to start posing a threat to other fans, it's posing a threat to local residents, it's posing a threat to even the teams themselves, then UEFA is going to have to act.
Simon Chadwick, thank you very much indeed. Let's give your voice a rest, sir. Interesting stuff you were coming out with, very interesting indeed. Jean-Emile Jamin, Simon then talking about when the European Cup final was relocated to Paris because of the Ukraine conflict, the mishandling of the event by the Paris authorities. It was Liverpool involved again, not apportioning any blame to anybody, it's just a fact. Liverpool playing Real Madrid. Gérald Darmanin, as I recall, spoke out about these English football hooligans. It's as though Darmanin had been watching football in the 1970s, because things have changed a great deal in England since the Hillsborough disaster and the reform of football and the Taylor report, which forced a change in football stadia. So here we are, Stade de France again. Thursday night, France versus Israel. Give us a context. What is this game? What is it about? What's at stake?
Nations League match, this new competition by UEFA, whereby France, if they even just get a draw, can progress through to the knockout stages. It's expected that the French team is going to completely dominate the Israeli team, but it's everything that's going to be happening in the stands around the stadium that is of concern. They could expect only 20,000 fans. That will obliterate
80,000 capacity, yeah.
And the previous lowest record in the Stade de France is in the 30,000. So that would obliterate the lowest record for the turnout. There is also an expected protest, a pro-Palestinian protest, that's going to happen in front of the Saint-Denis Mairie, the mayor office. Whether that ultimately does then affect or spill over to the area around the Stade de France, that's what the 4,000 policemen and 1,500 reservists are going to have to actually cope with. Bruno Retailleau, the interior minister now, who's replaced Darmanin, he has been very bullish, saying, as we heard in that report earlier, if France refuses or moves this game from Paris, it will show that the people who are against Israel or anti-Semites, that they have won, and basically that defeats the whole purpose. But now, interestingly, Belgium was faced with a similar episode, and they ended up moving their game to Hungary, and that wasn't so long ago. So it is very much a Franco-specific event. I do expect that there's going to be a massive cordon, a perimeter around the stadium, which stretches to such an extent that it won't reach any kind of effect. I do not expect anything like we saw in the Champions League final, because that was very much a mishandling of the fans that was streaming in, and so many fans at that. If you know the Stade de France, there's a bottleneck which can be created, and that's how they ended up just going one by one. That won't happen, obviously, with so few fans expected at the stadium. But this also comes in the context of PSG fans showing their support for Palestine. We
can show the banner that the Paris Saint-Germain fans put out at the Parc des Princes. It was the game a couple of weeks ago against Atletico Madrid, a European match. This banner, which these kind of things are banned from football grounds. Paris Saint-Germain is owned by, of course, Qatar. Qatar chief negotiator for Hamas. I'm not saying that this was smuggled in via the management, but, just put two and two together. Perhaps you can come to that. I can't make that assumption. But what we can see is a massive banner. You can't just seat that in a rucksack. That's clearly found its way into the stadium in some way, shape or form. And it says, La guerre sur le terrain, mais la paix dans le monde. And I think that's probably the nicest thing of the whole thing, to see that idea, the call for peace. Can I pause you, Jean-Emile, and bring in Katerina Pietlovic from the Palestine Football Association? When you see that kind of banner, I don't know whether you saw it, Katerina, but a massive banner displayed at the Parc des Princes, basically in favour of the Palestinian cause. Your comment on that?
Thank you to football fans for support. Obviously, is the first, and we see more and more throughout the Europe of this kind of fan actions that are not sanctioned by the club, and definitely not sanctioned by UEFA. UEFA, in fact, punishes any display of political expression that happens around their competitions. So what we need to distinguish here is the fan action and then the club, which is not really involved in it. For instance, we see a lot of support from Celtic fans. They have been most loyal supporters of the Palestinian cause there is, but the club in itself is really not involved in any of this. So while on the one hand also we see that, on the other we see what kind of power fans hold to change things, because at the time when the governing bodies are unable and unwilling, most likely unwilling to change the status quo and to apply their own statutes on the clear breaches of the statutory provisions by Israel FA, fans have the power to do something about it through their actions, through their club, through boycotts. And we will see, I hope, more and more of such actions in the future. In the Paris Saint-Germain flag and the banner that they displayed was absolutely massive. I'm not sure how they managed to enter into the stadium with it, but it's probably done in coordination with somebody who works at the stadium. So that is the kind of action that I hope we will see more and more, because for Palestine, this means a lot. People are watching, even people in Gaza are watching, and they are grateful for any support of this kind. Anything at all that will lift spirits and that will, in fact, force the governing bodies to act will help. We saw completely different attitudes towards, obviously, towards Russia and towards how the national team and the clubs were taken out of the competition. And now that we are discussing these issues of safety and security, one of the main reasons that was cited by FIFA, by UEFA, was safety and security, because what FIFA and UEFA said, that it would be impossible to hold any matches with Russian national team, even on neutral territory, whilst ensuring safety and security of all the participating teams, of all the delegations, official supporters, and that it would cause an enormous security risk. So this was said 4 days after Russia invaded Ukraine. At the time, there was no actual cases of any violence or any racism or anything at all happening. So they acted preemptively in a hypothetical situation to exclude Russia. But in case of Israel, they're willing to take all these security risks and put the local population of the hosting cities and put the teams themselves and supporters themselves of both teams into this situation where I am afraid that the violence can easily escalate into something that can end in fatality. And then we will be wondering who is responsible for this, and everybody will be passing the bucket to each other.
Katerina, in a word, yes or no, should Israel and Israeli teams be banned from competition?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Gershon Baskin, your sense, your take.
I think it's perfectly legitimate for Katerina and her friends in the Palestinian Football League to appeal to have Israel removed from the Football League. I think it's a legitimate political action. I'm sure that the state of Israel will fight back and do everything that it can to prevent it. But it's certainly more legitimate to do that than to use violence in the stadium or outside the stadium afterwards. Even the banner, which was quite impressive with the Free Palestine with the Palestinian flag and the Lebanese flag, is a legitimate political action. It may be against the rules of UEFA and FIFA, but it is an action by fans, apparently. It was somehow manipulated with people in the stadium. But again, I would much rather see that kind of thing happening than people being hit with sticks and stones and beaten on the ground, and which is not legitimate and has to be condemned. And I would hope that Katerina and people in the Palestinian Football League would say that people who use violence are acting against Palestine. It's not helping Palestine when Palestine is being perceived around the world as a violent group of people fighting for a really legitimate cause. And the distinctions have to be made here.
You speak so well, but I've got to come back with that question again. Yes or no? Would you accept that Israeli teams should be banned from competition?
It's very difficult for me to say yes or no. I think it's legitimate to make the cause. I boycotted South Africa during the days of apartheid and supported South African teams not being allowed to play in international games. And Israel is moving in that direction, in a very dangerous direction. And the Israeli people should be aware what our government is doing.
Simon Chadwick, your take.
So I too boycotted South Africa back during the 1980s, and so I'm a firm believer that boycotts can ultimately lead to the kind of positive outcomes that most people want. But I also agree with your previous speaker there in terms of this is a complicated area, and what I would like to see is sports governing bodies, be it UEFA or anyone else, actually heading towards the issues rather than running away from the issues. What we're not doing is we're not addressing how we should judge, how we should assess, how we should respond to these kinds of episodes. Because let's be honest, it's not just about Israel and Palestine. There are lots of things happening around the world. For example, in Myanmar, there are lots of things happening around the world, for example, in Ukraine. And what we're getting from sport is ad hoc, inconsistent, knee-jerk reactions that are based upon, as I mentioned earlier, a lack of expertise, a lack of understanding. And so what I would like to see as an outcome is sport more proactively engaging with the issues and really trying to get to grips with the complexities that these kinds of situations are creating.
Simon, do you think there's an issue here about the way sports authorities work? It's kind of in parallel with how the media works, because the initial reporting, of course, was one side of the story, which was leaning towards the Israeli version. Again, do you think sports authorities have a more Israeli-friendly take on things, whereas, of course, with the Russia situation, as Katerina was saying, Russia-Ukraine, they automatically acted to stop Russian teams taking part?
So I think you've got to keep in mind who is running sports governing bodies, and I guess in terms of the officials at the top of those organisations, they are elected. So what they're doing very often is they are making decisions based upon what they perceive their electorate wanting. And so instead of getting the best decision for sport or the best decision for football or the best decision for a particular group of people, what in actual fact you're getting is the best decision for the president, because the president knows next time around they need to get elected again. But there's also the economic imperative as well. And what you find is that governing bodies, and for that matter, athletes, are thinking about, well, how are our revenue streams going to be affected? A really interesting case, Mohamed Salah, when the conflict first started in October last year, the Muslim world, particularly the Middle Eastern Muslims, looked towards Mohamed Salah to say something about the conflict. In the end, when he did, he made a very neutral statement, and a lot of citizens of the Middle East and North Africa were disappointed with him. And I think one of the reasons for that is Salah had a series of endorsement deals with North American corporations, for that matter, with European corporations. And so what we can't lose sight of here is, despite the moral arguments, despite the political arguments, money and economics also play a big part in the kind of decisions that are made.
Simon Chadwick, that's interesting. Let me put that to Katerina Petletlovic, head of the Palestine Football Association Legal Department, also assistant professor of sports law at the Católica Global School. Do the likes of Mohamed Salah have a duty to speak out? That's one footballer. He could possibly just say, look, I'm just playing sport, leave me alone. Can I just get on with that? Does he have a duty to speak out?
Well, what kind of duty we are talking about? He certainly doesn't have any legal duty or any regulatory duty or anything like that. But in terms of moral duty, I would say yes. Unfortunately, most of the footballers, and I say most because some have been vocal and some have risked their careers for speaking out for Palestine. Most have decided to despite the fact that they have hundreds of millions and they can be comfortable till the rest of their life, they have decided to stay silent and not advocate. And for instance, Messi is a UNICEF ambassador. There are kids dying in Gaza with Ronaldo's shirt on. And as a UNICEF ambassador, Messi should have said something about the fact that there are over 100 children, footballers from academies and youth centers that have been killed. I would have expected that. I would have expected that at least on some level, and we have really seen none of it. And I cannot say they have legal duty, but I do believe they have moral duty. We have not seen them come out and say anything, because I guess there are too many pressures and that they are falling for them. I guess there are contract sponsors, contracts with the clubs, employment contracts. And finally, nobody wants, a trouble for themselves, because these days saying that killing children in Gaza is wrong will get you suspended from your club, and you will have to fight legal battles to get compensation and whatnot. So nobody wants to put themselves into that trouble and take that to do the right thing, which is disappointing.
Indeed, if sport and politics do mix into a cocktail, it's got a very bitter taste. Katerina, that's the message. Katerina, that's the message that we're getting, isn't it? Loud and clear. Jean-Emile, just on this issue of sports stars who do or don't speak out, I mean, clearly there are some who've actually gone on to say, Palestine should be free. I'm thinking of Sonny Bill Williams, the rugby player. But can you give us any more on those kind of issues?
Well, yeah, basically they are very few and far between. But exactly as you say, there have been some players who have spoken out and then been suspended for their efforts. I'm thinking of an Eintracht Frankfurt player. I can't think of his name off the top of my head. But then that comes back to bite them. So as soon as you show any kind of support, it's exactly like that. It basically doesn't work for them. Whether they have a moral obligation to say something, it is exactly the same as any other person working in any industry, whether you're affected by the money, whether you are affected by the line that you have to toe. Even us in media, it's the same thing.
We've got to go straight down the middle and tell the story as it stands. But if you're one of these people who's adored by millions of fans, surely that comes with that some responsibility to talk. What do you think, Gershon?
Well, I think everyone should speak out with a voice of morality and a conscience, and we should call for an end to this war immediately, to the end of the killing, to the release of the Israeli hostages who are held in Gaza. Some of them are active sport fans and players as well. The American Israeli hostage who was executed by Hamas was a big fan of one of the Jerusalem sports teams, and the team made a big effort for his release. So I think that all this horror that we're seeing over the past now more than a year has to end. And everyone should be speaking for the end of this war.
Gershon, we'll end on those words. Thank you very much for joining us. Gershon Baskin, former Israeli hostage negotiator, columnist for the Times of Israel and Al-Quds. Thanks to Katerina Plietlovich, assistant professor of sports law at Katolika Global School and head of the Palestine Football Association legal department. Thank you to Simon Chadwick, joining us from Coventry, professor of sport and geopolitical economy. And thanks, last but definitely not least, to our own Jean-Emile Jamin, France 24 sports journalist and often commentator on African football as well. That knowledge really served us well in this debate. Thank you for watching. Stay with us. There's more to come here on France 24.